Guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren. Seien Sie herzlich willkommen. Es ist uns eine große Ehre, aber eine noch größere Freude, wieder einmal als Partner der Sigmund Freud Privatstiftung die Sigmund Freud Vorlesung in unserem Hause zu haben. Ich bin sehr stolz, dass wir in Zusammenarbeit mit der Sigmund Freud Stiftung einen wunderbaren Künstler heute zu Gast im Hause haben, nämlich William Kentridge. Lassen Sie mich ein paar kurze einleitende Worte hinzufügen zu dieser Begrüßung, in denen ich für unser Haus, aber auch für uns Theatermenschen sprechen möchte. 1993, so lange ist es her, sah ich zum ersten Mal eine Theaterarbeit von William Kentridge, das berühmte Wojciech on the Highveld. Es war eine Performance, die er gemeinsam mit dem südafrikanischen Handspring Puppet Theater erarbeitet hat und die in der Folge über Jahrzehnte die ganze Welt bereist hat. Für mich war es damals ein Bühnenwunder, ein revolutionäres Bühnenwunder, vor allem seiner politisch dezidierten Haltung wegen, allerdings auch erinnere ich mich an ein Zusammenspiel von Darstellern, Puppen und der besonderen szenografischen Erfindung der gezeichneten Filme. Das war ein augenöffnendes, herzöffnendes und die Sinne ansprechendes, wirkliches Gesamtkunstwerk. Für Theaterschaffende ist William Kentridge auch ein seit Jahrzehnten bewunderter und, gestatten Sie mir das anmaßend zu sagen, Kollege. Nämlich der Künstler Kentridge hat Theater studiert, immer wieder im Theater gearbeitet, obwohl er so viel mehr ist natürlich als ein Theaterschaffender, weil er weit über die Grenzen unserer darstellenden Kunst hinausgehend denkt, erfindet und gestaltet. Das Thema seiner heutigen Vorlesung, Sie sehen es dort, A Defense of the Less Good Idea, hat sehr, sehr viel auch mit unserem Leben und Arbeiten auf Theaterproben zu tun und ist uns deshalb sofort sehr nah, obwohl man genau sein muss. Wir arbeiten nicht auf Probe im Theater, sondern im Erproben, im Spiel mit unseren Möglichkeiten und im Zulassen von Fehlern. Ohne diesen Vorgang, ohne die Freiheit, auch weniger gute Ideen ernst zu nehmen, wird nie ein Theaterabend entstehen können. Im Center for the Less Good Idea in Johannesburg hat William Kentridge einen Raum geschaffen, in dem Künstler verschiedener Disziplinen zusammenarbeiten, gestalten. Er hat damit zugleich einen geistigen Raum geschaffen und einen Raum, in dem Bedeutung kreiert wird, einen, um es auf Englisch zu sagen, Safe Space for Failure. Das ist ein wunderbarer, auch für Theaterleute, für Künstler, befreiender Ausdruck, eine Beschreibung unserer Arbeit. Ich freue mich sehr, dass William Kentridge uns heute aus erster Hand einen Einblick in diese Arbeit geben wird und begrüße jetzt als nächste Rednerin Frau Pessler vom Sigmund Freud Museum. Dankeschön.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you on behalf of the Sigmund Freud Museum and its Scientific Advisory Board to this year's Sigmund Freud lecture by William Kentridge. And I think it's very interesting that this lecture that has been held for so many years in Freud's honor around his birthday in May will this time focus on the question how the artist looks at the world and the living conditions of people. So, as you can imagine, also we are very proud that William Kentridge agreed to be the Freud lecturer this year, not only because he is so deeply involved in studying the state of the human being. His comprehensive work also visualizes not only the individual fate, at the same time also the socio-political environment that affects people. And that seems such an important issue in our days. So about that and more, Erik Porath will tell you a little bit. He is a media scientist and philosopher, came from Berlin to introduce a little bit into William Kentridge's work. And before I hand you over to him, I would like to thank Karin Bergmann, the director of the Burgtheater, for her kind hospitality. Also our partner, the Monika group, for supporting this annual highlight of our program at the Sigmund Freud Museum. and I wish you a very, very interesting Sunday morning with William Kentridge defending the less good idea. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be here on stage and a real pleasure to introduce you to the following Freud lecture held by William Kentridge. I first encountered the work of William Kentridge in 1993 at the Kampnagelfabrik in Hamburg, where the wonderful production of Woyzeck on the Highveld was being presented for the first time in Europe in this year. This collaboration with the South African handspring puppet company transposed the Büchner subject matter to South Africa's central region, which is marked by its history of mining. Indelibly etched in my memory are the impressive scenes of the carved wooden puppets with their expressive faces and the projection of hand-drawn films, at that time a theater technique not yet aesthetically worn out. The clash of the different cultures in South African society is made particularly apparent in the scene in which the clueless Woyzeck has to set the dinner table in a stately home. The indecisive back and forth of the forks and knives, is it left, is it right, produces a slapstick dance of the cutlery that brings to mind Charlie Chaplin's tramp who prepares his shoe sole as a cutlet, as well as conveying the lostness of someone alienated in his own country. Visible in the background were those scared steppe landscapes where the mining companies extracted the rich mineral resources and exploited the countless disenfranchised workers from across southern Africa. Images of colonialism, apartheid, and tourism have often been the focus of William Kentridge's labor and remain subjects he regularly visits. Maps of the colonial territories, depictions of the uninhabited, seemingly historyless African landscape, the gardens of paradise from children's books where the wild animals spend their supposedly peaceful existence. Kentridge's pictorial worlds bring back into view the landscapes around Johannesburg, so disfigured by mining, the landscapes that are excluded from the South African official self-portrayal. He also incorporates visual fragments such as documentary police photographs of shot demonstrators into his landscape depictions. This leaves the viewer with an almost surreal, though historical-based impression when the bodies of dead and mistreated suddenly lie strewn across the Highveld and then slowly disappear, as the course of events would suggest, leaving the landscape empty once again. It is the depiction of this disappearance without a trace that then leaves its mark after all, by recalling historical injustice and suppressed, unatoned history, using an image that in this form never existed. The artistic process thus presents itself as open-ended, without a foreseeable goal. At the same time, the artistic work does not present itself as a replication or portrayal of the historical reality, how it really was, but rather as a complex constellation of long past personal memories and acquired historical knowledge. Now I quote from Freud's interpretation of dreams. Examples could be found in every analysis to show that precisely the most trivial elements of a dream are indispensable for its interpretation, end quote. The English translation in the Standard Edition misses the mark in an important point. The passage is not about the most trivial elements of a dream, but rather the most negligible, marginal traits, geringfügigste Züge, which I would now like to bring your attention to. Freud was concerned with the fine nuances, the smallest variations, more or less with a unique feature of the particular psychological formation. If one takes seriously this maxim from Freud's practice of dream interpretation as an artistic practice, it becomes possible not only to create distinctive artworks, but also to derive a specific aesthetic, which distinguishes itself through its associative character, a strategy for calling forth the unfamiliar, the unknown, the unrecognized, also in the midst of something seemingly familiar. Kentridge has repeatedly emphasized the unpredictability of the work process and the influence of coincidence. In this connection, it does not have to do with the triviality, or to put it differently, the incidental, those most marginal traits, can become the main point. For this, though, a protected zone is necessary, such as offered by the psychoanalytic setting or the artist's studio. Kentridge speaks of a safe space for stupidity. But in fact, the most commonplace, banal experience offers enough grounds not only to evoke memories in the subject by association, but also to wake those more profound drives and wishes which the subject unconsciously follows and which, therefore, are able to induce symptoms, various mistakes in action and dreams. But sometimes an experience leads more or less directly to an insight, to an disillusionment. William Kentridge referred on several occasions to an incisive childhood experience. His father, Sidney Kentridge, was a lawyer representing family members of the 1960 Sharpeville massacre victims. In his father's study, the 6-year-old William discovered a longish yellow Kodak box, which he thought contained chocolate. But he discovered photographs of the murdered demonstrators. I quote Kentridge. Inside were images of a woman with her back blown off, someone with only half her head visible. The impact of seeing these images for the first time when I was 6 years old, the shock was extraordinary. I understood that the world was not how I imagined it at all, that things happened in the world that were inconceivable, end quote. Drawing later turned out to be the means of dealing with this unconceivable realization. Many of you, ladies and gentlemen, will have visited the large William Kentridge 5 Themes exhibition at the Albertina Museum here in Vienna in 2010-11, and may have seen there the film Felix in Exile, which captures in striking pictures the splitting apart of South African society. While working on Felix in Exile, completed in 1994, William Kentridge drew on police photographs used in a critical documentary film about the history of Soweto. Some extraordinary police photographs of people who'd been murdered or shot lying in the veld. William Kentridge commented on this work himself, and I quote, "Drawing them was an important process. The images I was shown were terrifying and impossible to look at. But the moment I started drawing them, a different process happened in terms of what it meant to look at them. What became interesting was the way in which making drawings of the images, the activity of drawing, in a way tamed the images, made them manageable, made the events they were describing graspable. Drawing something is a way of controlling it, not in real life, but in the life of one's head, end quote. In Sigmund Freud, we honor not only the revolutionary scientist who developed a method of studying human nature, its passions and abysses, but just as much the great writer whose work is distinguished by a textual, even poetic quality predestined it for repeated readings. Freud never presented a theory of aesthetics. However, the contribution made by Freudian psychoanalysis regarding questions of artistic productivity and the reception of art can hardly be overstated. And the significance of Freud's work is especially evident in the enormous influence he exerted on the cultural self-conception of our epoch, in particular on artists of various genres. William Kentridge can be considered an outstanding exponent of a connection between art and Freud's work on several levels. Substantively and topically, with his artistic work on subjective and collective histories of violence, on traumatization and memory disorder, on unconventional understandings of time and space, for example, in his magnificent work, The Refusal of Time, which was presented at Documenta 2012. Aesthetically, with his dissolves and silhouettes, his inversions between inside and outside, dead and alive, commonplace and alien. Think, for instance, of the espresso pot in Kentridge's film dedicated to Georges Méliès' Journey to the Moon. It blasts off into outer space right from the artist's studio and lands at a spaceship on the moon, where the view from the capsule window shows a landscape that looks like the Highveld. And last but not least, biographically, precisely because William Kentridge has developed his means of expression in the course of a complex biographical evolution into an admirable, unmistakably style. I am very pleased that William Kentridge is here today and look forward to his lecture titled Defense of the Less Good Idea. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming today's guest of honor, William Kentridge.
It's a wonderful theatre and extraordinary occasion to be talking to you and giving a defense of the less good idea. But I want to begin by remembering a conversation I had in Vienna at a dinner party many years ago and at the dinner was a psychoanalyst, I think from Hungary, a woman then a generation older than me, but about my age, and she was not so interested in small talk, in discussing what TV shows we were watching or anything. And very directly she said to me, "Tell me, are you satisfied with your life?" And I thought, well, how does one answer this question? I said, well, do you mean, am I happy? And she said, good God, no, only Americans are happy. So I think in this lecture, my hope is not to make you happy, but to find enough, to find a satisfaction in the ambiguity of the idea. And I want to talk about how we make sense of the world And I want to do this in reference to the studio, and I want to do it in reference to the studio in two ways. The studio as a physical space, and also as a metaphoric space for generating meaning. But the physicality of it is important, and it's interesting being here on a stage in a theater where the actual physical context in which this lecture happens becomes part of its meaning. And can't help thinking, having visited the Freud Museum yesterday, of the strange nature of the theater of psychoanalysis. The fact that there's a very clear scenography, that there is a chair in one position, there is a couch in another, and performers who have to perform versions of the same play for 3,000 episodes, 4 days a week for 5 years, the same two actors, the same two audiences listening, with strange moments and elements of French farce in it, that you have to make sure the patient waiting outside doesn't meet the patient in the room, the kind of terror of that. And in Freud's house, the absurdity of a door from his consulting room through into a lavatory for patients to escape before the next one comes in. A kind of no theater, as we know, repetition is very important in working through and talking through the process of analysis. So it's about what happens in the body and in the space between and around the words, as well as the words themselves, and what is the meaning one finds, as it were, beyond the rationality of our conventional argument. Now, the studio I want to think of as literally a physical space in my case, a very important, I can only work in the studio, and the space of it in a way becomes an expanded head. Because as in most artist studios, the walls are filled with things pinned to them, with newspaper cuttings, with an email, with a photograph taken from a magazine, with a drawing half completed that I've been working on, with an abandoned project from before. And the process of working very often consists of a walking around the studio. There's a kind of peripheral vision as you're walking around, looking at the different elements in the studio. And at the same time as this peripheral vision, there's a kind of peripheral thinking of textures and images and possibilities coming together to generate the energy when the work can actually begin. It's as if the 7-centimeter journey that a thought makes in your brain from one section to another, from the memory to the processing to all the different sections, is expanded into the 12 meters of the studio, walking from image to image, allowing that moment for an idea to spark. So we can think of the studio also as a place in which the world is invited in, and it comes in the form of both those physical objects of drawings, photos, emails, phone conversations, memories, in which fragments of the world fill the studio, and the studio becomes a place then in which they are all rearranged, connected, and then sent back out into the world, either as a drawing, as a film, as a story, as a performance, as a lecture. And this is obviously a very natural process and a very obvious process in the artist's studio, and it's not a particularly contemporary one either. There was a sense in which in the Renaissance the idea of collage was central to how artists worked, in the sense that there would be sketches of live models, and artists would get their assistants to pose for them to find the figures in a religious painting that would then be put together for the final painting. You have Caspar David Friedrich, who made many sketches of details of trees and of branches, and the paintings one sees of his landscapes are in fact constructed out of these different fragments from different sketchbooks, but seamlessly joined together, as the history paintings were seamlessly joined together. And what is significant about, I suppose, the 20th century history of art making is that suddenly collage, which is the natural technique of the studio and the appropriate activity of the artist, comes to the forefront. And suddenly, instead of collage being a hidden technique in which one can't see the process through which Caspar David Friedrich painted his tree, it becomes central. And the audience is invited to understand collage not as a technique of an artist, but as a kind of truth. a recognition that we have to make sense of the world through constructing it out of different fragments, that making sense of it is something we have an agency in doing, and it's not simply us receiving the world as it comes to us. We have to learn to accept falsehoods in order to say something more. And it also means that we give the image the benefit of the doubt, relying on the category of recognition, of seeing something and recognizing it as if we knew it already, which means that we knew it in some sense before we've seen it again on the sheet of paper. There are different swathes of understanding and association that are boiling through us, waiting to latch onto and make sense of images that come through the world. Now, Freud describes the psychoanalytic, both activity and space, as a Tummelplatz. And a Tummelplatz was both a place for acrobats to do their tumbling and their performance, but it was also a place for conflict, for jousting, for knights to try out their skills. And he describes the to and fro between the ideas of the patient and what the analyst is saying or doing as the space of the Tummelplatz. And it seems to me this is very close to what a studio is, where there is, in both cases, a safe space for stupidity. There is nothing so stupid that you cannot say in the psychoanalytic circumstance. And there's encouragement for not understanding rather than knowing what something means. And in a way, one of the lessons of the studio, and that I want to talk about today, is what does this mean? What are the ways of trying to allow this associative way of working to have central space? There's always a secondary revision in the way that the argument about does one dream in a sequence of ideas and images, as it were, does one have a film as one is dreaming, or in fact does one dream with many different images, and as you're waking, your brain does this construction of what the dream might have been, the secondary revision of constructing the story. And I suppose what the studio does is make this idea of a secondary revision of what something might mean, of what it could mean, a central activity. And this means that the category of provisionality, ambiguity, and paradox come from the edges of the world into the center. In the psychoanalytic space, of course, we're talking about two people, the patient and the analyst. But in the studio, a similar thing happens, and you have the division of the artist into two figures. The artist as someone who is making, and the artist as someone who is watching what he is doing. So you start with a sheet of paper, and there's a kind of possible first projection of what the image might be, of where it could fit itself onto the sheet of paper, a kind of feeling it in your body between a size and possibility, and one works very close to the sheet of paper, maybe an arm's distance from the paper. But very soon one steps back, and then one becomes the artist as viewer. And it's very hard not to be a critical viewer. And one looks at what's been drawn, and you can see from, as you step back, how badly done it is, how completely wrong. And one sets a series of instructions to the artist to lift the belly, to shift it. You can see that it's too low down. Lift the whole thing up. And which instructions one accepts with more or less good grace as the person making it. You can see that it's wrong, but you wish it wasn't, and one has to go back to it. And as soon as one steps back again, there's the new criticism. And you can see the horn is in the wrong place. If you're trying to draw a rhinoceros, just shift it. The tail is in the wrong place. You can, as you step back, it's completely obvious all the things that are wrong, but there's a gap between seeing those and being able to walk back and do it. And so the person doing the drawing gets more and more frustrated with the person watching behind to try to say, what am I meant to do with this? How's that meant to... There are very many good books. You can see there are very good books with how Dürer drew a rhinoceros, with different ways of doing it. If you would just take time off away from the drawing to step back and look at these books, you could see how easily it could be done. And the artist says, I'm not ready. Could you leave the room? Could you please just leave the room? It's kind of clear how it should be done. So this is a kind of a division that goes, first of the division of the artist split into those two different areas of trying to make sense in the material itself and then observing and watching it. And there's a conversation in different ways. There's a conversation with the material. What is the nature of the particular piece of charcoal? I used to get fantastic charcoal from an art shop in Florence. And this charcoal was made as a byproduct of making a cadmium yellow somewhere in Italy. And then the scientists of the European Union decided that this cadmium was carcinogenic, so they stopped the manufacturing of the yellow, and so the charcoal manufacture stopped. And for years it meant I've been on the search at every art supply shop trying to find this particular charcoal which had an extraordinary softness and blackness. And eventually, in South Africa, someone made me a piece of charcoal with the aerial roots of a swamp cypress tree. And ever since then, I've been hunting for other examples of these trees in this particular part of South Africa that have it. In other words, there's something about the nature of the sheet of paper, the charcoal, and that relationship of whichever material, which becomes not just a means or not just a medium, but also defines part of the meaning of the work, the ease with which it can be erased or leave a trace, or how dense it is on the paper. It's kind of an associative thinking. It's not the main subject, but even though it's at the edge of the main subject, the rhinoceros, it starts to become part of the very substance of the activity itself. And there's also a migration of images that go from one form to another. So trying an image that starts as a drawing, but that might migrate into an etching or a different print, is a different way of trying to track down what are the associations that might arise from it. And this is some examples of a current project I'm working on, which started with a series of cut-out drawings, black cut-out shapes arranged as a drawing. And they were in fact made in order to make a stereoscopic drawing, for which you obviously need two photographs taken a short distance apart. And it was a mixture between landscapes and texts. And you can see this is in fact the way the drawing was done, as a three-dimensional drawing, the rocks made out of paper, a background done, so that one could take two photographs a short distance away, which would give you the stereoscopic effect. So it was about, can one do a drawing which you know is a very two-dimensional flat activity, but which your brain turns into this illusion of three dimensions. And it's part of an ongoing question of what is it that we do when we see and when we look? What is the action we do when we construct in our brains without wishing to or without being able to stop ourselves these forms like anamorphosis and stereoscopy? Not in themselves, but as a very clear demonstration of the activity of making meaning we are forced into and we take part. But then there was a sense that some of these paper shapes, like this, which are two-dimensional paper shapes, could get a different substantiality. And it started saying, what are the different things that one recognizes? How direct does an object have to be? How clear does it have to be? How much do we have to know it? And how much can we rely on recognizing it? So the shapes, some are almost randomly torn, and there were some like this which were trying to find a form. To say, if you put two legs, if you put two pieces of paper at one angle, does it provoke a recognition of an attitude in a person? Does it become a different kind of man? And this was taking the torn paper and taking it one stage further into a kind of articulated paper puppet. And then the sense that if you take these different shapes, there's also a way in which they become kind of glyphs, standing in for a kind of a language, a word, a writing, and the way in which one arranges them becomes a kind of writing. And then the idea to turn these flat paper things into something substantial, like a word with a weight, which meant taking those torn paper shapes and working with wax to give them a solidity, to extrude them into something more or less a size, something that your hand can hold, that could feel a weight of it. In which there's, again, not so much the walking around the studio, but the real feel of what it is in your hand with the wax. Here I'm working with people from the foundry that is going to transform the wax sculptures into bronze to get the weight that one wants. And this is a view of one of the two studios I have in the center of the city, which I will refer to later on in the lecture. So the torn paper cutouts go through another transformation, as I say, into these wax versions of them, and this is replacing the paper cutouts with their thicker wax pieces, where they still have a sense of they can both exist as a shelf of sculptures, but they can also almost work as the lines of a text. Not to say that there's a meaning that you could read into them deliberately, but they give an impression that one ought to be able to, or one might be able to, that somewhere within them is the possibility of taking these different elements and constructing a kind of meaning. And then the last stage, when they're actually cast into bronze, where they have a weight and, as it were, go back into a landscape of objects. So it's expanded from a landscape drawing into a kind of lines of text with the possibility of it being almost like an encyclopedia. There was the idea, as it was being made, which one could fill the studio with hundreds of these different possible images, a kind of universal archive of possible ideas. And I think what they show, not what those particular pieces show, but what I'm interested in is the space for ambiguity, not being certain what they mean, for a provisionality, that they could be arranged in different way, and also understanding the role that biography obviously has in the meaning. To give one example, if one thinks of a hammer and a pine cone, a hammer and a pine cone, which are just simply two objects, one can also, if I think back, and they have a very specific meaning. When I was about 3 years old, I was in the kindergarten at a nursery school, and there was a fight between the older boys, that is to say, boys aged 5. And one was armed with a hammer, and the other had a pine cone. And they were hitting each other in the heads with the hammer and the pine cone. And this was completely shocking. A hammer I could understand, but to hit someone in the face with a pine cone with all its knobbly edges and branches, this seemed inconceivable. And in a way, it stands in the way these fundamental experiences do as a kind of critique of all utopian thinking afterwards, of the impossibility of hoping that people are going to find a calm and peaceful way to live. I thought, for me, it suddenly shocked me in the same way that the Sharpeville photographs did 3 years later that Erik referred to, of a new understanding of what it is in the world. But on the other hand, the drawing is simply one of a pine cone and a hammer. So there's a sense also of understanding how in our understanding of the world, every moment of it is suffused with biography. And whenever anybody says the world is, or makes an objective statement, what is always taken out is that mixture of understanding that's very clear in the studio, that the drawing, the film, is always a membrane between the world and ourselves. So the world comes in, and it meets the sheet of paper halfway. And onto the drawing we're doing of a rhinoceros is projected, as you're drawing it also, all the previous images of rhinoceros, from Piero Longhi to Dürer to newspaper photographs of poaching of rhinoceroses in South Africa at the moment. So each time one says this is, one retracts from that whole history of, in my biography and with my sets of associated things that I know, this is where we are in the world. In this sense, allegory becomes both possible and complicated, that an allegory that says one thing but means another, we have to understand the indeterminacy of that secondary meaning. But there is the question of the sentence versus the riddle which makes us aware of that which we don't know and makes us active constructors of the sense. And in a way, the drawings or those glyphs work in that way as possible riddles rather than as final answers. Some years ago, I phoned a friend, a couple, and I asked what Adrian, one of the friends, was doing to Basil, who I was on the phone with. And Basil said to me, Adrian is making a tree search. He's busy with a tree search. And I thought, what is a tree search? I don't know what a tree search is. And there was an anxiety. And then I thought, in a moment, I thought, of course, a tree search, it's the internet term. You have a word, and then you follow it up, and the branches in different directions, and you follow a smaller twig, and that's your tree search. You can refine it into all sorts of different ways. And of course, I know what a tree search is. So at the end of the conversation, I said to Basil, so what was Adrian looking for? And he said, what do you mean? I said, you said he was doing a tree search. He said, no, I didn't. I said he was making a T-shirt. So what happened in that moment, because it's in one moment, there's an anxiety about not understanding the world or that word, a panic which provokes a kind of an imaginative leap to fill in the gap, to leap over that which we don't know, and in the same moment both curse myself from being stupid, think myself bright, because of course I've understood it, construct the whole thing. I could have written an essay about the nature of a tree search with diagrams. And that it became an example of how we can't resist trying to fill in the gaps, to make a sense of the world, to meet the world even in its incomprehended form as it comes towards us. So there are different kinds of sentences. There are sentences which are very clear, which we understand straightforwardly. There are others that we need to construct a meaning for, as if we understand them, a half understood, a bad translation, a word in a sentence in a foreign language that we have to jump at or guess at. And then, of course, texts that just become noise. And there've been a project of a lot of different texts which are halfway between reading and looking. And where there's a kind of parapraxis of misunderstanding and giving the parapraxis the benefit of the doubt without necessarily feeling one has to find in this a symptom of a neurosis. But to understand the pleasure that can be found, and I suppose this is the advantage of not being in a clinical but in a studio situation, where the original trauma may well be there, but it is not the subject of what one is doing, and one takes all those processes both as revelatory of how we operate in the world, but also as an encouragement for an exploration of how things work. So there are a series of blue phrases. So, there was a memory of a particular childhood dream of a bicycle, and the bicycle that I never had has lasted all these years, by which is meant the 7 other private thoughts which do not get written about. There's a sense hovering at the edge of our taste buds, waiting for an impulse, a pressure, for a meaning. You can feel the impulse towards a meaning here in one's chest muscles, as if one would leap onto a possible meaning. The words approach it, but they never reach it. Their predictable phrases start to unpredict. The information becomes a deformation, a deformation, as if words go off on their own on a foraging trip trying to find other images. As if somewhere in the margins one could write down the proof of the theorem. If one just waits and waits, if one just had enough time to write it down. Who could have predicted it? It comes as such a surprise. We need to defend the life-saving unnecessary. Now, these phrases, in fact, started with a fantastic packet of lapis lazuli pigment from Afghanistan that I was given and needed to find a home, a use. And so it became these series of phrases from notebooks, many of which could be expanded, like the story of the pine cone in the hammer, into something very specific in terms of my memory or sets of meanings, but which also are thrown out in the hope that they become a provocation for other combinations of private histories to common memories to general thoughts. That's from a Botswana proverb, a proverb from Southern Africa. If the good doctor can't cure you, find a less good doctor. And it's both a joke, but it also became the basis of what I've called here the less good idea. And about 8 months ago in Johannesburg, I started in my studio in town and in buildings around it, a center for the less good idea, is its title. And it works more or less on the principle that I've been describing to you. Literally, it means it's a space in which artists, poets, musicians, dancers come together over different workshop periods and see what they gather and learn from each other. Some projects are started in advance, but developed by the meetings that happen. And then after a couple of months, there's some evenings of performance in the studio, which turns into a theater for those 3 days, or turns into a boxing ring, depending what is needed. And it's done on the basis of trying to avoid or get past the good idea. Because often when you start with a project, one starts with a very clearly good idea, and there's an excitement of this clear vision of this good idea. And all the forces you gather for this, to make the drawing, the film, the piece of theater, and then the work begins, and very often as the work begins, the certainty of the good idea starts to waver. Its logic, which is very clear when it's written down as a proposal, falters when it actually hits the stage. And what comes in are fragments, moments discovered in the process of trying to follow the good idea. There's something at the edge, a chance combination. Someone rehearsing a piece of music in one side of the room, and the way someone is asleep on a chair in another corner of the room. The drumming happening somewhere else. Chance combinations. And what holds us in these moments, which happen in all rehearsals or in all improvisations, are moments of revelation, of suddenly seeing the possibility of a connection. And it feels there's a real energy within the body that comes in these moments when you say, okay, let's try to capture what we've just found at the edges. And of course, very often the improvisation can't be repeated, but it's allowing that moment to try to have its place. And acknowledging that there are all these ideas in the periphery, hovering at the edge, too timid to come in to face the good idea, as if they're saying, if I could just make a suggestion and the good idea slaps it down. Can't you see we're thinking over here? And the other one saying, if I could just make an observation. And the good idea says, he wants to make an observation. I mean, just let me finish. And there's the sense of the big vowels and the grand sounds of the good idea rolling on and gathering platoons of words around it to defend itself and sending them off, with the belief that if those get annihilated in the first skirmish, there are lots more words that can come in. Now, the language of certainty has a long history. From Plato onwards, we understand that certainty and violence go together. From the first story of the prisoners in the cave looking at shadows, there's an understanding that one needs violence to bring the people out of the cave into their enlightenment. A kind of version of Stalin's beating people into happiness. And it strikes me that one of the great virtues of psychoanalysis that it has taught us is that there is no cure, that there's a certain degree of incompletion, of misery in the world, of not happiness that is built into who we are, and the deformation that arrives in trying to think we are past and beyond that. It's both an artistic question, but it's also a political one, of understanding the disasters that have followed these huge ideas which have been us, and the belief that the only hope really is in the smaller ideas, things that come from the periphery, that occupy their space in the center, that shift and change, that aren't there for all time, that are both provisional and ephemeral. Now, practically, what does this mean? It means a week of rehearsals and improvisations in the studio, some weeks of preparation, and then 5 days of performance. So I'm going to show you a few examples, 4 examples of the first season that we had. All of the pieces I show in some way relate to language, and trying to see what are the edges of the sense we make of language. The first piece is an extract of a performance from Not I by Samuel Beckett that an actress did.
Out into this world, tiny little thing before it's time and it got for what? Girl? Yes, tiny little girl, into this, out into this, before her time, God-forsaken hole, cold, found herself in the dark. And if not exactly insentient, that she could still hear the buzzing so-called in the ears, and a ray of light came and went, such as the moon might cast, drifting in and out of cloud, but so dulled, feeling so dulled, she did not know what position she was in. Imagine what position she was in. Whether standing or sitting, but the brain, what? Kneeling? Yes. Whether standing or sitting or kneeling, but the brain, what? Lying? Yes. Whether standing or sitting or kneeling or lying, but the brain still in a way. For her first thought was, oh, long after, sudden flash, brought her as she had been to believe, with the other waifs in a merciful God.
The next piece is a kind of conversation of one person, which is a dancer in the boxing ring on his own. So there's also a flexibility of the studio being transformed into a theater, and then later on into this boxing ring as another kind of Tummelplatz, literally. And the third piece is a piece which is done with a group of musicians called the Blind Mass Orchestra, in which there was no score, simply a series of instructions given to the members of the orchestra, and also some instructions given to the audience. So it was again about understanding it was much more exciting in real life than I'm afraid it looks on video, but just to give you a sense of, again, somewhere between, something that happens between a language and having to do a leap from it. he and I both thought, what's the joke? And the last extract I want to show you is from a dance piece which was based on Ravel's Bolero, although the actual musical Bolero was extracted. And the section I'm showing you is one in which the voice, which is used for language very clearly, although in its speeded up form in the Beckett, becomes a very different, has a very different relationship to language itself. It's slightly longer than the other pieces. It's a dance piece called Requiem Request, made with a choir from Johannesburg. That's from the Center for the Less Good Idea. What comes out of this at some point is in one strain, obviously there's a lecture which one can give and sentences following each other with more or less coherence as it continues, but also a sense of the space to acknowledge the inadequacy of words, the gaps between a clear understanding in the world. A use of words to show the limit of words themselves. And this is something obviously that becomes very clear in the field of art history, in the ideas of the Dadaists and in their performance. There was a sense of a calamitous logic existing in the world that had brought Austria and Germany and all of Europe to its terrible state between 1914 and 1918. And a sense of an imperative to find a different logic. It's both an epistemological logic, how do we make sense of the world, but there's also a moral element to it, of saying that these ways of understanding the world have failed us, and one needs to find a way for contradiction, paradox, to move from the periphery into the center. And that the performance of the absurd both becomes a piece of naturalist theater or art making. It is a description of the world, but it also has an ethical dimension of resisting the grand idea, the huge logics, which are so fundamentally flawed in understanding how we make sense of the world. And I want to end with a fragment of a current project, which is both a dictionary as a diary, so drawings that emerge and get added to it as they continue, but also which has different sounds and different things that go with it. And the sound I'm going to use today is a fragment of the Kurzschwitters Ursonate, which was written just after the First World War, starting in 1923 and working on it, in which again he plays with language, not even at the edge of meaning, but where the rhythms and sense of it talks about both incomprehension, a delight in our brains trying to make sense of the world, and seems to me a strong provocation for hanging on to the idea of the less good idea. It's about 6 minutes long, the film. Fums povota ta u pogif qui O dlr bibe fumspe bibe fumspevo bibe fums povota fums povota ta u fums povota ta u pogif qui de desen mpf tilf tu ju ka Rinsekete b inskermu zu ense rinskermu rakete b rumpf tilf tu zu ense zu inskermu zu ense zu rinskermu zu ense zu rinskermu rakete b rakete b fums povota ta u UCWTB 5 Rakete Rünsekete 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 B F Beve Fumspe Bevere Fumspe Bevereta Fumspovata ca. Fumspovata ca u. Fumspovata ca u p. Fumspovata ca u p. Beverata ca u pogif. Fumspovata ca u pogif qui Raketerinsekete. Raketerinsekete, 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 b f beve. Fumspe bevere. Fumspe bevibepe. Fumspe vibepe beveribepe. Fumspe vibepe bevetabepe. Fumspe veretabepe beveretatsabepe. Fumspevertatsabepe beveretatsa-ubepe. Fumspevertatsa-ubepe beveretatsa-upogif. Fumspevertatsa-upogif beveretatsa-upogif qui Raketerinsekete, 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 raketerinsekete. Raketerinsekete, 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 B, 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 Bevere, 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 bevebepe, 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 beverebepe, 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 beveretabepe, 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 beveretatabepe, 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 beveretatabepe. Qui est, qui est, qui est, qui est, qui est, qui est. Det doesn't nr puff tilf to. Det doesn't nr, doesn't nr, puff, puff til, puff tilf, puff tilf to. Det doesn't nr puff tilf to. Det doesn't nr puff tilf to. Det doesn't nr puff tilf to. Ju ka. Fums bovotata u på gif qui er. Det doesn't nr puff tilf to. Ju ka. Rinsakete bb. Insker mu tu ense tu rinsker mu rakete bb. Tsikete bb insker. Rinsakete bb insker. Rakkete baby insker. Tsikete baby insker. Rakkete baby insker mu. Rinsikete baby insker mu to enze to rinsker mu. Grim, glim, gnim, bim bim. 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 Lanketer gil, rumf tilf tu. Lanketer gil, tju len trill. Lumf, tumf, trill. Lanketer gil, pepe, pepe, pepa, uka, 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 uka. Lanketer gil, pi, 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 tsuka, 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 tsuka. Lanketer gil, rumf, rumf, rumf. Lanketer gil. O, B. O, C. O, Z, Y, X, V, V, U, T, S, R, Q, P, O, N, M, L, K, I, A, H, G, F, E, D, T, B, A. Danke schön. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for this. Thank you.